Atenção! Nossas coberturas, análises e conteúdos têm como base a sã doutrina católica e a contra-revolução. Nosso foco está em analisar os fatos à luz destes valores e pilares. Nossa missão é a busca incessante pela verdade. Muito boa tarde, meus amigos. Sejam todos bem-vindos aqui a mais um programa no seu canal PH Vox. E este é um PH Vox entrevista muito especial. Hoje nós conversaremos aqui com o Dr. Patrick Michaels, ele que é um ex-conselheiro da administração de Donald Trump para as questões ambientais. E nós vamos falar aqui sobre diversos temas importantes dessa pauta que vem sendo cada vez mais tomada, né, pela esquerda no mundo, por todo o esquema revolucionário, seja ele eurasiano, imperialista oriental e também o globalista, né, tão dito aqui nos últimos meses no Brasil. E é muito importante, né, um trabalho como esse, e nós aqui, eu quero agradecer em nome de toda a equipe do PH Vox, o apoio de vocês, porque graças a todo esse apoio, graças a toda essa credibilidade que vocês nos emprestam, é possível trazermos aí convidados do Quilate, do Dr. Patrick Michaels, para uma entrevista como essa. Então, nosso muito obrigado e esperamos de coração que você possa aproveitar muito essa entrevista, tem muitas informações importantes aqui para vocês, e que, acima de tudo, se você gostar desse conteúdo, compartilhe com seus amigos, com seus familiares, nos seus grupos, né, de WhatsApp, Telegram, e ajude cada vez mais pessoas a estar bem informada sobre essa pauta, que não pode ser negligenciada, entregue de mão beijada na mão da revolução. Vamos lá, então? Olá, meus amigos, sejam bem-vindos a mais um PH Vox Entrevista. Eu sou Paulo Henrique Araújo, é um grande prazer estar aqui com vocês. E hoje nós temos aqui a honra de receber um convidado muito especial na nossa jornada aqui do raio-x do ambientalismo. Nós faremos a entrevista em inglês e, após o início da parte em inglês, adicionaremos aqui, né, legendas para vocês conseguirem acompanhar a entrevista sem a necessidade de estar fazendo uma tradução simultânea. Eu darei o meu melhor aqui no inglês, farei o melhor que eu posso por vocês, mas toda a conversa estará legendada. So, we can start now. Welcome, Professor Patrick. It's been a pleasure to have you in that interview. I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation.
Oi, Paulo. It will be fun. Ask me something.
Bom, so I will introduce you to our audience in Portuguese now, your CV. Vamos lá, pessoal, então. O senhor Patrick J. Michaels, ele é um afiliado sênior do Competitive Enterprise Institute e do CO2 Coalition. Ele foi diretor do Centro para o Estudo da Ciência no Cato Institute, professor, pesquisador de ciências ambientais da Universidade da Virgínia por 30 anos e climatologista do estado da Virgínia por 27 anos. O Sr. Michaels também foi presidente da Associação Americana de Climatologistas Estaduais, a American Association of State Climatologists, e coordenador do programa do Comitê de Climatologia Aplicada da Sociedade Meteorológica Americana. Ele publicou inúmeros artigos sobre o clima, seus efeitos e a própria ciência, incluindo o mais novo título Cientocracia, publicado pela Cato Books. Ele foi coautor do artigo do ano sobre clima, premiado pela Associação Americana de Geógrafos em 2004. Ele possui bacharelado em Biologia e mestrado em Ciências Biológicas pela Universidade de Chicago, além de doutorado em Climatologia Ecológica pela Universidade de Wisconsin em Madison. Dr. Patrick, I have just made a brief introduction about your CV, but I would be better for the audience to know more about you from your own words. Would you mind to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Pat Michaels. I'm with the CO2 Coalition and with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I know you've mentioned that. And I was a research professor of environmental sciences at University of Virginia for 30 years. So I know this field quite well. I got into it in a very strange way. I was in a graduate program at the University of Chicago in ecology, mainly plant ecology. And it became apparent to me that none of these ecologists could read a weather map. And they didn't realize that climate is not constant. And so a lot of the theory back then, this would be in the early and mid 1970s, was that weather and climate have very little to do with plant distributions and movements. And I thought, that's absurd. Well, there was a guy at the University of Wisconsin by the name of Reed Bryson, who was a real pioneer. And the people at Chicago said, well, he kind of thinks like you. Maybe you ought to go up to Madison. It's about 150 miles from Chicago, and talk to him. And immediately we got on great. And I said, somebody has to do a PhD in ecology and climate science at the same time. And he said, well, you can do that here. And I thought, you're kidding me. And so that is how I became who I am. I was then recruited to University of Virginia, which was kind of surprising for someone straight out of graduate school. And the more I looked at the climate issue, mainly the climate change issue, the more I realized that we didn't know very much at all. And people were saying things, even back in the early 1980s, that were simply absurd. So I raised some objections, and then I learned that raising objections on this was, well, it's not a lot of fun. But I kept on it, and I think I was able to, write a fair number of books on the issue. And I'm kind of happy that I took the path I did. And frankly, I think the climate models that work, and there are not a lot that work, by the way, predict much less warming than, say, what the United Nations predicts as an average value. In fact, they predict so little warming that it would seem to be the best policy would be to do nothing and promote economic development rather than the de-development that is inherent in these net zero policies, which are never going to work.
Right. It's an important level we start that interview. Let's talk about climate change for the Brazilian audience.
Sure.
What is the truth about that, Mr. Patrick? Is that a real global warming? Are we walking towards to the doomsday? The world is surely going to the end.
Well, climate is never stable. It's always changing. And that is because of the nature of the planet that we live on. We have a planet where 70% of the surface is water. The remaining 30% has a lot of mountains in it that interrupt the flow of winds created by the fact that we have a rotating planet. Nothing is ever in what we call equilibrium. And so therefore, adjustments are always being made within the climate system. Consider that over North America, much of North America, as little as 14,000 years ago, which is a blink of a geologist's eye, there were thousands and thousands of feet of ice. And then it went away, and things warmed up and the sea level rise went up. And, the carbon dioxide concentration was fairly constant after the ice age, and then it began to increase a very little bit in the 19th century. And people started to think, well, gee, this could warm things up. Well, the planet is warmer than it was. The surface is warmer than it was 100 years ago. But it's very clear that a warming that occurred in the early 20th century, meaning about 100 years ago, which was of considerable magnitude, that couldn't have been from people putting CO2 in the air because we hadn't put enough in the air. Yet it warmed nearly 0.5 degrees C. And then there's another warming that begins in the late 1970s. It goes to around the year 2000, and some people say it stops. Some people say it slows down. Some people change the data to get what they want. That actually happens. So that warming probably has more to do with carbon dioxide than the early warming. But do we really care whether it warms? And that's the question that I think people don't look at very seriously. If it warms not very much, and it warms more in the winter than in the summer, and more at night than during the day, that wouldn't seem to be such a bad thing. And that is the way that carbon dioxide warming works. It does warm the coldest air masses of the winter more than the hottest air masses of the summer. It warms the nights compared to the day, so it lengthens the growing season. And CO2 itself makes plants grow better. You know, as long as the warming isn't some runaway large value, and as I said, I think the computer models that work indicate that it's going to be relatively modest, what's not to like?
Yes. In that same topic, let's talk about your experience, academic experience. Could you tell us about the challenge that you have faced in the academic throughout your career regarding your stand around climate change and global warming?
Well, I was always in a challenging situation because Reed Bryson at the University of Wisconsin was one of the first people to say that human beings could change the climate in ways that would be ecologically detectable and meaningful. And when he said that, holy hell rained down on him. Nobody believed that. That was as wacko a position as it would be for somebody today to say that there's no such thing as climate change. So I knew the battles and how to fight them when I was in graduate school. And so when I began to conclude that, we were on the low end of a predicted warming and everybody got mad at me, that was nothing new. You just have to learn to live with it.
Fine. And could you share your experience in the climatology as well as counseling process that you have suffered at university on the big media corporations?
Well, that's an interesting question because, universities, including University of Virginia, are extremely left-wing. And the environmental science department at University of Virginia, which is a very prestigious department, was dependent upon a tremendous amount of government money. It started with acid rain, which was a craze in the 1970s and the 80s. And then it went to ozone depletion, and then it went to global warming. And so you could see that anybody who was going to say, well, I'm not so sure that this issue is the end of the world, is not going to be real popular. I made a lot of friends, I recall, by saying that, we can't seem to find a lot of damage from acid rain. And rain naturally has a pH below 7, meaning it's acidic. So maybe we should just call it half acid rain. And that always got a rise out of the crowd. But of course, people were somewhat grumpy that I was pointing this out. I don't know. I've just been a contrarian, and I think most scientists should be. we've lost, I think, the desire to ask serious questions as all the science departments have become beholden to the federal government for tremendous amounts of money. And they're not going to get that money if they say it's not a problem.
Right. Switching gears here, talk about CO2. Is CO2 such environment villain?
Well, if we didn't have CO2 in the atmosphere, we wouldn't be here because we are dependent upon plants.
Point.
We are dependent upon plants, and plants are dependent upon CO2. And animals eat plants, we do, and then some animals eat other animals, we do. So all this is brought to you by CO2 on a planet that is neither too hot nor too cold. So I don't know if you have read Voltaire very much, but in Candide, the philosopher Pangloss always talks about we're living in the best of all possible worlds. Well, we're not. Tell me what the best concentration for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is. I can tell you this. If you were a professional grower of plants in greenhouses, you would say it's about 3,000 parts per million, because they raise the concentration from the current background, which is a little over 400 parts per million, to several thousand parts per million to make their plants grow better and faster, and to have them produce more fruit. If you're talking about farming, I am sure that farmers would like a higher CO2 concentration for several reasons. One, it makes plants grow better. And two, as we mentioned earlier in this interview, because it tends to raise the temperatures in the winter more than the summer, that means that CO2-induced climate change lengthens the growing season. That's the period between killing frosts. Now, down there in Brazil, you have a lot of places that don't have to worry about these things, but we do up here. And so I would think that an ideal concentration with regard to food production would certainly be quite a bit higher than it is now. Now, if I could, I'd like to talk about the effects of carbon dioxide on global vegetation. Would that be okay with you?
Yes, sure, please.
Okay. Since the late 1970s, we have been monitoring the Earth's vegetation with satellites. And one of the things we monitor is basically how green it is, how much green matter is covering the surface of the Earth. And we know now that for decades, since the satellites started taking these measurements and continuing through today, that the planet is getting greener and greener and greener. And the most interesting part of this is what the satellite data shows us is that the places on the planet that have gotten the more greenness are the tropical rainforests of Brazil, the tropical rainforest of Africa, and the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific Islands. Well,
Mr. Patrick, are you sure?
Absolutely. I mean, you can take a look, if somebody wants to take a look, I believe Nature magazine is considered pretty prestigious. There's a paper by a guy by the name of Zhu, Z-H-U, et al., published in 2016. And the title of the paper gives it away. The title is called The Greening of the Earth and Its Drivers. And it shows ubiquitous greening, again, particularly in the tropical areas and in the high latitudes where growth is limited by very short growing seasons. So, yeah, that paper has been cited a lot, and it's really definitive, and it shows that you don't have to believe me. Just go read the paper. You can get it online.
So,
yeah, if I could go on. That paper is very interesting because it, as the title says, it also examines the drivers of planetary greening. And they used some statistics, et cetera. and found that 78% of the planetary greening was a direct result of the CO2 we're putting in the atmosphere. About 10% was a result of the climate change that we've caused. And there are another small percents that were caused by increased nitrogen deposition and land use changes. Turns out 91% of the greening of planet Earth is a direct result of human activity. So are you sure we want to stop that? Do we want to tax people for greening up the planet? I think there are some serious questions that need to be asked. Meanwhile, the world goes on its net zero fantasies, which I'll be happy to talk about.
Yes. So after hear that, I will ask you, Mr. Patrick, what are the objectives behind such demonization that CO2 has been suffering lately? What are the interests engaged in that matter?
There has been a long tradition of opposition to fossil fuels, a long tradition, which I think is very misplaced, of opposition to economic development, which of course is a result in many ways of the combustion of fossil fuels. And, people can find a climate model and say, oh my God, it looks like it's going to warm up 4 degrees Celsius in this century. It's not true. It's just not. It would have to get warming like crazy, and it's not. Or sea level is going to rise another a foot between 2020 and 2030. That just came out a couple of months ago, and I hate to say it, but some of this stuff is so bad that it's funny. If that were happening, you would see it now. Or all the ice or tremendous amounts of ice are going to fall off of Antarctica. And, I have a computer model that shows this. And then you look at the computer model that's making that forecast and ask it to simulate the temperature of today or temperature change in recent decades in Antarctica, and it predicts 10 times more change than has been observed. With all due respect, Paolo, that model doesn't work. But the environmental community points to it all the time. And so do scientists who benefit from raising the specter of gloom and doom. And I am talking right now to the people who put together the quadrennial U.S. national assessments of climate change. They know that they are relying on a model that doesn't work, but they know that very few people, besides me and my apparently very few friends, know it doesn't work. So it's not a conspiracy. It's self-interest. Look, if you're getting millions of dollars a year for your university to do research, and you say it's not a problem, that money goes away. And even worse things happen to a scientist who's been getting all these funds and the money goes away. They no longer can fly in first class. And, once scientists start flying in first and business class, they don't want to go back to the back of the plane. I assure you of that. And so there's just a lot of self-interest that keeps this darn thing going.
Well, okay. In the matter of renewables energies, let's talk about solar energy and wind power.
Okay. First,
okay.
Let me just say one thing. Basic physics teaches you that there is no such thing as renewable energy. The concept doesn't exist. If energy were renewable, the first law of thermodynamics would go backwards. And, even the president of the United States, even Joe Biden, cannot reverse the first law of thermodynamics. But with regard to renewables, would you like to talk about solar energy and wind? I would. you know, in Brazil, we know here, you have to have a stable power grid. When the amount of electricity flowing into a grid becomes unstable, the grid itself becomes unstable. I mean, you have a wonderful situation there because of all your hydropower. And if somebody's going to invite me back down to Brazil, I want to see those big dams out in the western part of the country. They look pretty spectacular. But if you have solar, well, guess what? The sun's below the horizon half the time. So the output from solar at night obviously is zero. The sun is near the horizon a couple hours a day, and it doesn't produce very much energy to power those solar panels. And some days are cloudy. And on a cloudy day, often only 10% of the incoming solar radiation hits the ground. You can't forecast those things with the accuracy necessary to maintain a stable grid. Now, about the wind, wind is extremely variable. Obviously, here's something, Paula, that you may find interesting. It is on the hottest days and on the coldest days that the wind stops blowing. That's why the temperatures move up or down so much, because the air is not being stirred. Those are precisely the days in which you need the most electricity. So you can talk all you want, not you. You're a good guy. But people
so thank you, my friend.
People who should know better can talk all they want. There just will never be a renewable, if you calling that solar energy and windmills, powered society. You have to back it up with a source of power that you can turn on really quick. And that would be usually natural gas. You have to have nuclear. If you're serious about this, my question when I'm involved in debates, one of them will always be, well, what do you think about nuclear power? You know, it doesn't emit any carbon dioxide, and it produces a lot of electricity. It's remarkably safe. And of course, the same community that is upset about global warming hates nuclear power. And my answer, when I get the usual answer, is, you're just not serious. I don't know what you're serious about, but you're not serious about climate change unless you consider nuclear power. So this whole renewable thing, it's not going to work. They should be called unreliables instead of renewable, because everybody knows they're unreliable. And woe betide the country that tries to produce extremely large amounts of renewable. The place that is just, we have an expression here. I like dogs, okay? I have a great dog. I have a giant dachshund named Anthony Wiener Dog. But the whole British environmental policy with regard to global warming has just gone to the dogs, literally. They're taking this beautiful country and putting these windmills all over that are just destroying the viewscape. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. So, Paul, let me ask you a question. So, Britain's a medium-sized country, has some industry. And there are some industries they haven't chased away yet, but they seem to be working on it. So, what percentage of Great Britain's power comes from all those windmills on average? Guess what? Last year was 4%. That's all you get 4%. For your money, 4%. Whoa. But yet, politicians will say, well, we installed, so many megawatts of wind power. Well, there's something called the nameplate capacity, which is how much power you would get out of this windmill if it ran all the time. But they don't run all the time. And the what's called the load factor for wind energy is probably somewhere between 15 and 25%. In other words, if it says it's going to produce 100 units of electricity, it really means it's going to produce somewhere between 15 and 25, which is why you only got 4% in the United Kingdom. In any country that tries this, they're seeing the problems. Germany, situation has gotten so bad in Germany, thanks in part to they didn't seem to learn a lesson in the 20th century that Russia's not their friend. So they decide to get all this natural gas from Russia, and the bad things have happened, and now they are dependent upon them. So these policies, these renewable policies and energy policies are a joke. And without making my answer too long, I can tell you Brazil's notional policy of net zero by 2050 is a joke. You're not going to be net zero by 2050. I mean, even if you had electric cars, which are never going to happen in the numbers that people say they are, where are you going to get the electricity from? You got to get it from somewhere, and it takes a lot. So, yeah, there's a lot of people saying things, not really thinking them through, and I guess they get grumpy with me for telling the truth.
So in that renewable topic, Mr. Patrick, have we been creating a problem to the next generations with this topic?
With the what? Pardon?
With renewables energy,
Yeah.
that solar energy, wind power, that policy, we have a trouble for the future generations?
We do. But, fortunately, in a way, that's beginning to appear now. We are beginning to see how unstable these renewable powered grids have become, and how dangerous they have become. So here in the United States, in California, which, has a very, very large economy, some might say it's in the top 10 economies in the world, they don't have enough power now. They don't have enough dependable power. Can you imagine a state that's that rich announcing, on certain days in the summer, well, you have to turn off your air conditioner, or you have to run your house at 80 degrees Fahrenheit? That's a travesty. That's taking a first world economy and turning it into a second world or even third world economy in certain places. That's what these policies do. And people are getting very sick of them. I'm very excited about the upcoming by-election in the United States coming up in November, because there is going to be a wholesale rejection of this green stuff. I mean, I've seen enough in the polls. People are really tired of the lights not being on. People are really tired about energy being so expensive in a country that was self-sufficient in energy. We were a net exporter of energy during the Trump administration. And now we're not. We're no longer self-sufficient. We have enough natural gas for hundreds of years. Just a very fortunate part of the earth. And how the party in power does not want to exploit that is beyond my comprehension. Natural gas produces much less carbon dioxide per unit energy than does coal. So you should be for it. But no, there's opposition to it. Places like the state of New York, which has shale natural gas underneath its surface, outlawed exploiting it. And there's a lot more of this shale natural gas across the border between New York and Pennsylvania. And literally in New York, you can look across the border and see the jobs. You can see the people working. Why states are committing economic suicide for this, I don't know, but I presume that states that have reasonable democracy will ultimately come to their senses.
For sure. And let's talk about Brazil again, my friend. We know that you have already been here and know our country. During your visits, conversations, and experiences, what were your impressions about climate agenda here in Brazil?
Well, when I was there, which was I was there twice, quite several years ago, it wasn't so bad because, first of all, you're producing a lot of fuel simply growing it because you have a climate that can produce tremendous amounts of sugarcane, which is the best source for ethanol as a fuel. You have a lot of hydropower. Why in the world you would even think of a net zero policy by 2050 now? I don't understand where that came from. It's not going to happen unless you go nuclear. And again, I don't know what the feelings are about substituting nuclear for fossil fuel are in Brazil, but that's really what you have to do.
Look, here in Brazil, when we talk about nuclear, it's talking some circles of politicians' interests, but in the way of nuclear power to get to bombs in Bellic issues. When we talk about nuclear to power like electricity, it's not a topic. It's not a topic in Brazil. We don't talk about that in the media, our politicians. We don't talk about nuclear with power to electricity or other way to use the atomic power.
Well, that's a shame because you're not going to hit net zero. And, somebody's going to be very embarrassed one day to have to say, well, we really can't do this. We're sorry because we chose the wrong path, or we weren't guided by markets. We were guided by politics, unfortunately. Though, again, in Brazil, you have some tremendous advantages with regards to emissions, which include the tremendous amount of hydropower that you get from Western Brazil. That's one of the wonders of the world. I don't know if you guys realize how fortunate you are with that.
Yes. And in the same topic of Brazil, what's your opinion about Brazilian agriculture and the cattle raising, Mr. Patrick?
Brazilian agriculture and I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
And cattle raising.
Oh, cattle raising. Well, have another.
Sorry about my English, my friend.
No, that's not my problem. My hearing is worse than your English, I assure you. My answer to that is, how about having another hamburger? People like their diets to have concentrated protein in them. And the way you get that is to raise cattle and pigs and things like that, and chickens. I don't see anything terrible about this. If you're concerned about the methane from cows, and some people express concern about methane from cows, well, the rate of methane increase in the atmosphere hasn't changed like for decades and decades and decades and decades, even though there are more cows. So are they really that important? And the other thing I want to say is, let people eat what they want. It's one of the few things that we have some control over. I don't think people want to be living on soybean-based diets very much. If you offer people the choice between a soybean-based diet and a diet that is a mixed vegetable and meat diet, they'll take that second one every time.
I hate that thing. I hate.
It's true.
The soy meat, it's...
Oh, you're talking about the artificial meat made from soybeans?
Yes.
Yeah, well, all that does is that that moves the methane production from the cow to the human. It does.
All right, man.
It's pretty obvious.
Yes, I agree with that. Would like to let you free to deliver a message towards Brazilian society reading climate agenda, my friend.
Sorry, I just lost my earpiece. Could you try that again?
We're also sure. We would like to let you free to deliver a message towards Brazilian society regarding climate agenda.
Well, first of all, the climate is changing. It's warming up slightly. Human beings have something to do with it. They don't have everything to do with it. But it has warmed up about a degree between 1900 and now. The temperature records that we have, they have some problems. And sometimes they're changed in ways that people ask questions about. We have different temperature records that probably are more accurate, reliable from satellites and weather balloons. And they show modest warming. What's not to like about that? The other thing that's really important to notice, Paolo, is the richer you are, the cleaner it is. And that's just not true between nations. It's true within nations. Go to the poor parts of Brazil, and you will see the environment is much more degraded than in the more affluent parts, or even within a city. Take a look at the huge sprawl of Sao Paulo, and you can see where the environment is degraded, and it is pretty horrific. And then there are the very nice places that tend to be affluent. So, if we really cared, I would say this to the Brazilians, and I say this to everybody that I can. If you really care about the environment, then you want the economy to grow, because it is clean economies that protect their environment. And poor economies, they don't have the money to do it. We saw this in the United States. In the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. economy became large enough that we could afford environmental protection. And the air cleaned up dramatically, particularly in the eastern United States, and then in the western United States, in California and the Los Angeles basin. We saw Europe about 15 or 20 years after we achieved enough affluence to clean the air, that they began to do it. They're still behind the United States. And we see in China an economy that doesn't have enough per capita wealth to clean things up. It's horribly dirty in those big cities. And I mean unhealthily dirty. There is no doubt about that. So you want to promote development, or you want to promote economic development to promote environmental protection. And anybody who thinks that deindustrialization, which some of my greener friends say, well, we just got to stop having our economy grow. They don't get what a train wreck that will create, not just for day-to-day life, but for the environment itself. It takes money to protect the environment. It doesn't happen for free.
Yes. Dr. Patrick, we appreciate your participation in this interview, my friend. Surely the information you have brought to us are quite important. They have potential to help Brazilian people open their eyes and see the manipulation regarding climate agenda in order to obtain a social and political control. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to have appeared with you.
All right. E para vocês, meus amigos aqui do PH Vox, né, essa entrevista ela faz parte aí da nossa iniciativa Raio-X do Ambientalismo. Essa foi a primeira entrevista, você já encontra diversas matérias de vários colunistas, vários autores, né? Inclusive também a Rafaela, que tem nos ajudado e também nos ajudou aqui com essa entrevista, e vocês poderão cada vez mais se atualizar, porque não basta falar contra, né, a agenda ambiental, mas é extremamente necessário entender o que de fato está por trás e não entregar a pauta para a revolução. Isso é fazer o serviço que eles esperam. Então precisamos também propor a discussão. e trazer para o debate pontos válidos com pessoas importantes que saibam, né, especificamente sobre o assunto, como o Dr. Patrick aqui. Então, eu agradeço muito a cada um de vocês, um forte abraço e até a próxima, pessoal. Tchau, tchau.
Uma das melhores sensações da vida é, em meio a momentos de dificuldade, sabemos que não estamos de fato sozinhos. Uma presença amiga, uma palavra de conforto, uma força que nos impulsiona fazem toda a diferença. É uma luz que ilumina em meio às trevas. Nós do PH Vox estamos reformulando toda a nossa política de membros e contamos com a sua ajuda. Será uma alegria ter você como peça viva deste trabalho. Teremos 4 perfis de assinatura para membros, com muitos benefícios para quem de fato está caminhando ao nosso lado. Acesse a página e conheça cada um deles. É uma honra estarmos lado a lado nessa jornada virtuosa em busca do crescimento espiritual e intelectual. Iden vel, iden all.